When my son got married, I made a decision that would change everything. I kept quiet about the $53 million my late husband left me. It wasn't because I didn't trust my son. It was because I understood how money can twist hearts and blind even good people. I watched that young woman walk down the aisle in her white gown, smiling like she owned the world, and something deep inside me whispered that silence would be my shield. 4 days after the wedding, just when the flowers on their table had begun to fade, she came to my door. She wasn't alone. A lawyer stood beside her, tall, polished, holding a briefcase. Her smile didn't reach her eyes when she said she wanted to talk. In that moment, I knew my silence had been the smartest thing I'd ever done. Thank you for watching and spending time with me today. I'd really love to know where you're watching from, so please leave me a comment and tell me. My name is Maria. I live in Ohio, and this story I'm telling you isn't just about money. It's about what happens when love and greed sit at the same table. I've lived in the same small house for more than 40 years, the one my husband and I bought when our son was just learning to walk. It isn't big, but every corner carries a memory, and after Robert passed, those memories became my comfort. He was a quiet man, sharp-minded, a builder of things that lasted. He never cared for fancy cars or gold watches, just honesty and good work. When he left this world, he left me enough to never worry again, but he also left me with a lesson that I hold on to tighter than anything else he gave me. He told me, Maria, money has no soul. It borrows the one who touches it. Protect yours. I never forgot those words. So when the lawyer and my new daughter-in-law stood on my doorstep, pretending concern but radiating something colder, I felt Robert's voice echo in my mind. I stayed calm, invited them inside, poured tea, and watched as they looked around the house as if measuring the walls. I noticed how her fingers traced the furniture, how her eyes lingered on the family portraits. Not with affection, but with calculation. The lawyer began speaking about my health, about how at my age, it might be wise to have someone assist with decisions. I smiled and nodded politely, though my heart sank a little because I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about control. When they left, the silence in my living room felt heavier than ever, but I sat down and whispered to myself, "Not today, Robert, they won't win today." After they left that day, I sat for a long while staring at the empty teacups on the table, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. The air felt heavy, almost sticky, as if their presence had left a residue behind. My heart hurt, not because of fear, but because of disappointment. I had raised my son to be kind, to think for himself, to see through people's pretenses, yet somehow this woman had slipped through every warning I'd quietly tried to give. I remember the night before their wedding, Robert's photograph sitting beside my bed. I whispered to him that I hoped our boy had chosen well, that she would bring him peace, not trouble. But now, watching what was unfolding, I knew that wasn't going to be the case. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the snow fall softly across the driveway. My house looked calm, but my mind wasn't. I replayed every conversation I'd had with her, the fake sweetness in her voice, the way her eyes wandered around my living room, not with admiration, but with calculation. She'd ask questions about the company Robert once owned, about the house, even about the safe in my study. I brushed them off at the time, but now they played back in my memory like puzzle pieces clicking into place. I could almost hear Robert's laugh, the one he used when something confirmed what he already knew. He'd warned me once that charm is the cheapest mask a person can wear, and that greed never knocks politely, it barges in with a smile. That's exactly what she did. I spent the next few days pretending nothing was wrong, cooking simple meals, watering my plants, calling old friends, keeping my routine steady. But deep down, I was watching and waiting. My son called briefly, his voice distant, distracted. He said they were busy settling back into life after the honeymoon, that Melanie was helping him get things organized. I could tell she was there beside him, listening, guiding his words. I didn't want to accuse him of anything, so I just told him I loved him and that I was fine. The truth is, I wasn't fine. I felt a storm coming, quiet but strong, and I knew I had to be prepared for it. That night, I went into my husband's old study. opened the drawer where he used to keep his papers, and pulled out a small notebook he'd written in during his last year alive. In it were his thoughts, instructions, and advice for me in case anything ever went wrong. He'd written that I should never let emotions lead when logic is needed most, and that when people come for what isn't theirs, the smartest weapon is patience. I held that notebook close and felt my fears slowly settle into focus. If they wanted a fight, they would get one, but not the kind they expected. I wouldn't scream or beg. I would outthink them, just like Robert taught me. So I took out my own list, names, documents, accounts, everything I'd quietly secured since he passed, and by midnight, I already knew who to call and what to do. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a strategist guarding her home, her peace, and her husband's legacy. And as the clock struck 12, I whispered to myself, let's see how clever they really are. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, long before the birds began their soft chatter outside my window. I made myself some coffee and sat quietly at the kitchen table, looking out at the thin mist that covered the yard. I always believed that if you start your day with calm, you can face anything that tries to shake you later. As the steam rose from my cup, I thought about my next step. I had already decided that I wouldn't react out of fear. Fear clouds judgment, and I couldn't afford that now. I called the investigator I'd hired months earlier, a man named Charles who had once worked for my husband's company. He was discreet, loyal, and sharp as a blade when it came to uncovering what people tried to hide. I told him what had happened the day before. Every word, every expression on their faces. He stayed silent for a moment, then said he'd dig deeper into her background again, just to be sure nothing new had come up since the wedding. I thanked him and hung up, then sat there for a while, listening to the clock tick on the wall and the faint hum of the heater. Around mid-morning, I decided to visit the local bank. The branch manager had known Robert and me for years, and though I didn't discuss details of my finances, I wanted to make sure everything was secure. I walked through the snow-covered sidewalk, every step crisp and deliberate. Inside the bank, I spoke quietly, checking that all documents, transfers, and trusts remained untouchable without my direct consent. The manager smiled kindly, assuring me that my precautions were airtight. Still, I knew that greed has a way of slipping through cracks, so I tightened them even more. I left the bank feeling lighter but alert. The way you feel when you know you're being watched but refuse to look over your shoulder. When I returned home, I stood for a long time in front of the mirror by the hallway. I saw an older woman, yes, with lines of time carved gently around her eyes, but behind those eyes was someone who had survived loss, love, and life's lessons. That reflection gave me strength. I thought about my son, about the boy who used to hold my hand in crowded streets, the one who once brought home wildflowers just to make me smile. I wondered what had changed in him, or maybe what she had changed in him. The thought hurt, but I pushed it aside. Love doesn't disappear overnight. It just gets quieter when it's ignored. By late afternoon, Charles called back. His voice was steady, professional, but I could sense the weight of what he'd found. He told me she had debts, large ones, creditors from 2 different states, unpaid loans, and a trail of short-lived jobs where she charmed her way in and vanished when questions arose. There was even a man, older, recently divorced, who had accused her of manipulation. It wasn't proof of a crime, but it painted a clear picture of who she was. I thanked him and asked him to keep everything documented, quietly. He agreed, reminding me that patience was our ally. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat near the window again, watching the snow pile gently against the glass. My hands rested on the notebook Robert left behind, and I could almost feel his presence beside me, calm, composed, guiding me. I whispered to him that the storm we feared had arrived, but that I wasn't afraid. He had prepared me for this, even without knowing it. And as I turned off the light and the house fell into silence, I promised myself one thing. I would not let anyone rewrite the story of what Robert and I built, not while I still had breath in my body. The next few days passed in a blur of silence and thought, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but sharp, like it's waiting for something to happen. I kept to my routines, cooking breakfast, reading the morning paper, and taking short walks down the street, pretending everything was normal while my mind worked through every possible move they could make next. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. People talk too much in small towns, and I didn't want gossip to become their weapon. Instead, I smiled when neighbors waved and nodded politely when the mailman greeted me. But inside, I was building a wall, brick by brick, made of patience and preparation. Charles called again on the third day. His tone told me before his words did that what he'd found was worse than either of us expected. He said she'd filed something, an early petition suggesting that I was unfit to handle my estate. It hadn't gone through yet, but it was being drafted by that same lawyer who'd come to my house. My son's name was on the paperwork too. Hearing that nearly took the air out of me. I thanked Charles, hung up the phone, and sat there, hands trembling, staring at the wooden table that had carried so many family dinners. I thought of my son's laughter when he was small, how he used to reach across that very table to steal pieces of bread from my plate, and now that same hand was signing papers to question my mind. I felt the ache in my chest rise like a wave, but I didn't cry. I'd learned long ago that tears only make you weaker in the eyes of those waiting to see you fall. That night, I opened Robert's notebook again, and read a line I hadn't noticed before. It said, "If you ever find yourself surrounded by people who mistake your kindness for weakness, don't shout to prove your strength. Plan in silence and let the results speak." I smiled faintly and felt a calm settle over me. The next morning, I called my attorney, a woman named Linda, who had handled our affairs for years. She was firm, clever, and didn't scare easily. I told her everything, from the unannounced visit to the documents Charles had uncovered. She listened without interrupting, then simply said, "Maria, they've picked the wrong person to underestimate." We began working immediately. I sent her copies of everything. Every letter, every legal notice, every scrap of information Charles had gathered. She advised me to prepare a full record of my finances, medical checkups, and property documents to prove my stability beyond any doubt. I spent that entire day gathering it all, each paper a small act of defiance against those who thought they could erase me. When I looked around my house later, nothing had changed physically, but I could feel something different in the air. It was strength returning, quiet but steady. Still, at night when I turned off the lights, I couldn't help but think about my son. I wanted to believe he was being misled, that she had whispered things into his ear until he couldn't separate her words from his own thoughts. I hoped, deep down, that the boy I raised was still in there somewhere, buried under confusion. But whether or not he saw it, I knew one thing clearly now. Love would not save me from this, but preparation would. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt no anger, only resolve. I had faced life's storms before, and this one I would face standing tall. The next morning began with a heaviness in the air, the kind that makes even the light coming through the curtains feel different. I woke early, earlier than usual, because my thoughts wouldn't rest. I kept thinking about my son's signature on that petition, about the way he must have looked when he signed it, convinced he was doing the right thing, or maybe just too blind to see the wrong he was helping create. I went to the kitchen, made myself some coffee, and sat in the same spot where Robert used to read the paper. The house was quiet, but my mind was loud. I kept hearing his voice telling me that people will show you who they are when they think you can't defend yourself. He was right. They thought my silence was weakness. But silence has always been my weapon. Before noon, Linda called and said she'd arranged a meeting with a judge she knew personally. She wanted to get ahead of whatever paperwork was being prepared before they could use it against me. Her confidence steadied me. I dressed neatly, took my folder of documents, and drove downtown to her office. The air was cold, the kind that bites through your gloves, and I remember watching people hurry past, everyone living their own little stories while mine felt like a movie I never agreed to be in. When I walked into Linda's office, she greeted me with that same calm assurance that I had admired for years. She told me she'd already spoken to her contacts, and if they filed anything, it would be challenged immediately. We went through every page together, my finances, my health reports, every legal document that proved I was of sound mind. There was something almost empowering about it, seeing my life reduced to papers, but knowing that every line stood solid against their lies. As I left her office, I saw my reflection in the glass doors. There I was, a 72-year-old woman standing tall, holding her life in a folder, and for the first time in days, I felt proud instead of afraid. I drove home slowly, watching the trees bend slightly in the wind. When I pulled into my driveway, a small car I didn't recognize was parked across the street. It sat there idling, the driver pretending to scroll through a phone. I knew enough from experience to understand what that meant. They were watching me, trying to catch some sign of confusion or instability, something they could twist. Instead, I walked straight past them, calm and unbothered, my head held high. Later that evening, Charles came by with new information. He'd traced some of her activity back to a man she had been involved with before meeting my son. It turned out she'd been part of a fraudulent investment scheme that collapsed, leaving others bankrupt. She disappeared just before the investigation began, and now here she was, trying to secure her next fortune through me. I listened carefully, my stomach tightening with every detail, but I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I simply nodded and said, "Let her keep digging. The deeper she goes, the more she'll bury herself." After he left, I sat by the window again, looking out into the darkness. I could see the faint glow of that same car parked down the street, its headlights dim, the driver waiting. I smiled quietly to myself. They had no idea what was coming. I had my documents, my lawyer, and my faith in the truth. And truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to light. I turned off the lamp beside me, whispering softly, "Robert, I'm still protecting what we built." Then I went to bed with a calm heart, knowing that the next time they tried to come for me, I wouldn't be the one caught off guard. A few days later, the knock I had been expecting finally came. It was early afternoon, the sky pale and heavy with clouds, and I had just finished folding laundry when I heard it. The sound was sharp, deliberate, not the kind of knock that comes from someone visiting out of kindness. When I opened the door, there she was again, standing on my porch with that same smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. This time, she didn't bring the lawyer. She came alone, dressed in expensive clothes that couldn't hide the unease in her posture. She greeted me politely, pretending this was just a casual visit, but her voice trembled slightly. I invited her in because I wanted to see what kind of performance she'd give when she thought I was still the same quiet woman she'd met before. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her legs crossed neatly, her eyes scanning the room like she was trying to measure its worth. Then she started talking, saying how worried she and my son had been, how they just wanted to help me manage things. I listened, my hands folded on my lap, saying nothing, just letting her fill the silence with her rehearsed concern. When she finished, she leaned forward and asked if I'd thought about signing over some responsibilities, just to make things easier. That was the moment I saw it clearly, the desperation hiding behind her calm tone. I looked straight at her and smiled the way I used to when my son tried to lie as a child. Then I said quietly, "My dear, you've practiced that speech well, but next time, rehearse it for someone who believes you." Her face stiffened, and she quickly stood up, her confidence breaking for the first time. She muttered something about misunderstanding and hurried out before I could say another word. When the door closed, I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs and reminds you that you're still in control. I knew that visit was her warning shot, the last test before she tried something bigger. But she had no idea I was already steps ahead. I went to my desk, opened my notebook, and began writing everything down. The time, her words, her expression. Because when the truth finally came out, I wanted every detail to stand like stone. The following morning brought a strange stillness, the kind that tells you something is shifting beneath the surface. I woke to the sound of distant thunder, though the sky was only gray, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm had finally reached its edge. I moved through my morning quietly, making coffee, tidying the house, pretending life was normal, though I could sense that the next chapter of this fight was about to begin. Around noon, Linda called to tell me that the court date had been confirmed. My daughter-in-law and her lawyer had officially filed the guardianship petition, claiming that I was no longer capable of handling my affairs. My stomach tightened when I heard it, not from fear, but from a kind of sadness that sits deep. The kind that only comes when someone you love chooses to stand on the wrong side of the truth. I spent the rest of the day preparing everything. I organized my documents, every bank statement, property record, and medical report neatly stacked in order. I even baked a small batch of bread, not because I was hungry, but because I needed something familiar to fill the air, something that reminded me that my home still belonged to me, and not to the lies being whispered about me. Later that evening, I received an unexpected call. It was the young paralegal who worked at the same firm as her lawyer. Her voice was soft and nervous as she explained that she couldn't stay silent anymore. She said she'd overheard conversations, plans to use false medical statements, and exaggerated claims about my forgetfulness to convince the court I was unfit. I thanked her for her courage and assured her that her words would not be forgotten. When I hung up, I sat there for a while, letting it all sink in. It didn't surprise me, not really, but it still hurt to hear it confirmed. As night fell, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the lights of passing cars reflect on the wet pavement outside. I thought about my son again, wondering if he had any idea what was being done in his name. Maybe he believed her completely now. Maybe he thought this was for my own good. That thought broke my heart more than her greed ever could. Still, I reminded myself that pain and clarity often arrive together. Robert used to say that truth doesn't need to shout, it just waits for lies to crumble. I held on to that thought, breathing slowly, letting it soothe me. Tomorrow would be the beginning of their undoing, and I would face it with grace. I blew out the candle on the table, whispering quietly to myself, "They think they know who they're dealing with, but they have no idea how strong silence can be." The day of the hearing came faster than I expected, though I had been preparing for it in my mind for weeks. I woke before dawn, the house still and dark, and stood by the window watching the faintest light stretch across the sky. There was a kind of peace in that quiet moment, the kind that comes when you know the waiting is over. I dressed carefully, choosing a dark blue suit jacket that Robert always loved, the one he said made me look like I carried authority without saying a word. I pinned a small brooch to the collar, not for decoration, but as a reminder of him, of the life we built together, of the strength that still lived inside me. When I arrived at the courthouse, the hallway smelled faintly of old wood and paper, that dry scent that holds too many stories of broken trust and quiet victories. I walked slowly, not out of weakness, but because I wanted every step to remind them that I was not a woman to be hurried or frightened. When I entered the courtroom, they were already there. My son sitting beside her, his head low, her hand resting lightly on his arm, like a snake coiled around something it wanted to keep. The lawyer gave me a polite nod, one of those professional gestures that hide arrogance. I sat down quietly, opened my folder, and waited for it to begin. When they started presenting their case, it sounded rehearsed, filled with half-truths and practiced concern. They spoke about my age, about how I sometimes took longer to answer messages, about how I had made questionable financial decisions by keeping my wealth private. I could see people nodding along, and for a moment, I felt the sting of humiliation. But then I remembered Robert's words about composure being the greatest form of power. So I smiled. Not a broad smile, but the kind that says, "You have no idea what's coming." When it was our turn, Linda stood up calmly, her voice steady and clear. She laid out every document, medical records showing I was in perfect health, financial statements proving I managed every account flawlessly, and then, piece by piece, she introduced the evidence Charles had uncovered about Melanie's debts and the fraud investigation she'd run from years earlier. The room fell silent. The lawyer who had come to my home that first day shifted in his seat, his confidence cracking like thin ice. My son looked from one face to another, confusion and shame slowly replacing belief. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was firm and cold. He said the petition was not only denied, but that an investigation would open into the financial activities of the petitioner herself. I didn't need to look at her to know her face had gone pale. I simply folded my papers neatly, stood up, and thanked the judge before leaving the courtroom. Outside, the wind was sharp, and the air felt cleaner than it had in months. I walked slowly down the courthouse steps, the sound of my heels echoing on the stone. I didn't look back once. The fight was over, at least the part that mattered most. They had tried to paint me as weak, confused, and lost, but all they did was remind everyone that wisdom has its own kind of armor. And as I got into my car, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just relief, but freedom. When I got home that evening, the house greeted me with silence, the kind of deep quiet that follows a storm after it's finally passed. I placed my bag on the table, took off my jacket, and stood there for a moment, just breathing. The smell of home felt different, softer somehow, as if the walls themselves were proud of what had happened. I made myself a cup of tea, the same way I had on the day she first came to my door, but this time, the air carried peace instead of tension. I sat at the kitchen table, looking around at everything I'd protected: Robert's old armchair by the window, the family photos, the small vase of dried flowers he'd picked years ago. For months, I had worried that all of it would be taken from me, but now I knew it would remain exactly where it belonged. Later that night, I got a call from my son. His voice was unsteady, quiet in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. He didn't say much at first, just that he didn't know what to believe anymore, that everything he thought he understood had fallen apart. I listened, not interrupting, letting him find his own words. Then he asked me if I had known about her past all along, and I told him the truth. I had suspected and I had prepared, because that's what his father would have wanted me to do. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke again, his voice cracked a little. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't seen what she really was, that he should have protected me instead of doubting me. I didn't scold him. I didn't remind him of what he'd done. I just told him that learning the truth is never easy, and that forgiveness doesn't erase the wound, but it keeps it from becoming a scar that lasts forever. After we hung up, I went to my bedroom and sat by the window. The moonlight poured across the floor, soft and pale, and for the first time in months, I felt calm enough to truly rest. I thought about all that had happened, the lies, the fear, the betrayal, and I realized that strength doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes, it's the quiet choice to stay still when others expect you to fall. I ran my fingers across Robert's notebook one last time and whispered a thank you to him for preparing me long before I ever knew I'd need it. As I turned out the light, I felt no bitterness, only gratitude that truth had found its way through the noise. Some people spend their lives chasing peace, but I had learned something deeper. Peace comes when you stop defending yourself to those who never deserved an explanation in the first place. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside my window, their songs soft and steady, as if the world itself was reminding me that life always goes on. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel that tightness in my chest. The air in the house was light again, carrying the faint scent of the lilac candle I'd lit the night before. I made breakfast slowly, not out of habit, but because I wanted to savor the calm. The eggs sizzled in the pan, the kettle whistled gently, and every sound felt like a small piece of normal returning to me. I sat at the table, sipping my coffee, thinking about how far I had come since that first knock on my door. It was strange, how something so cruel could leave behind something so clear. I had spent so many weeks holding my breath, waiting for the next move, the next lie, the next betrayal. And now there was only stillness, the kind that lets you hear your own thoughts again. Later that day, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The snow had begun to melt, and the air smelled fresh, carrying that clean scent of new beginnings. People waved, smiled, and though they didn't know everything that had happened, I could feel their kindness in small gestures. I passed the little park where my son used to play when he was young, and I stopped for a moment, watching the empty swings sway gently in the breeze. My heart ached a little, not with anger, but with longing for what once was. I knew things between us would never be the same, but I also knew that sometimes distance is the only space where love can learn to heal. I whispered his name softly, hoping that wherever he was, he could feel that I had forgiven him. Not for his sake, but for mine. When I returned home, I opened the windows to let the air move freely through the rooms. I walked from one end of the house to the other, touching the walls, the furniture, the things that had been part of my life for so many years. Each object held a memory. Each memory a story, and I realized that no one could ever take those away from me. I sat down in Robert's old armchair, the one that still carried a faint trace of his cologne, and I closed my eyes. I thought about everything he'd taught me, how he had prepared me not just to live without him, but to stand on my own when life tested me. I smiled quietly, knowing that even in his absence, he had kept his promise to protect me. As evening settled in, I watched the sun sink behind the trees, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. It felt like the closing of a chapter, not with loud goodbyes, but with gentle acceptance. I had survived something meant to break me, and instead it revealed who I truly was. I understood now that strength isn't in wealth or reputation, but in the quiet moments when you choose dignity over despair. I looked out into the fading light and whispered to myself, "I'm still standing, Robert. I made it through." Then I smiled, not out of pride, but out of peace, because I finally believed it. A few weeks passed, and the rhythm of my days slowly returned to something that felt almost like peace. The phone stopped ringing with questions, the letters stopped coming, and the eyes that once watched my every move had turned elsewhere. I found comfort in small things again, in tending to my garden, in reading my favorite old novels by the window, and in walking down to the bakery on Sundays just to smell the fresh bread. It's funny how normal can feel like a miracle after you've lived through chaos. Every morning when I opened the curtains, I whispered a quiet thank you. To life, to Robert, to whatever unseen grace had carried me through. Then one afternoon, when the air was warm enough to keep the windows open, there was a knock at the door. I recognized it instantly, that hesitant rhythm, like someone unsure if they were welcome. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, and there she stood. Melanie. She looked nothing like the woman who had come before with a lawyer and arrogance in her eyes. Her hair was unkempt, her shoulders slumped, and the brightness she used to wear like armor had dimmed. She said she only wanted to talk, that she wanted to apologize. Her voice trembled when she said she hadn't known it would go that far, that she'd lost everything, including my son's trust. I stood there, silent, holding the door halfway open. For a moment, I thought about all the pain she had caused, all the sleepless nights, all the moments I'd spent wondering if I was losing my own child. I could have said many things, but instead I simply told her, sometimes sorry arrives too late to be heard. And then I closed the door, gently, without anger or triumph, just finality. I stood by the door for a long time after she left, listening to the quiet that followed her footsteps fading down the driveway. I felt no satisfaction in her misery, only a kind of calm acceptance. She had made her choices, and life had given her the mirror she'd been avoiding. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood by the window, watching the sun filter through the trees. I thought about how pain can change a person, how it can harden some hearts and soften others. Mine, I decided, had softened. Not toward her, but toward the world. Because surviving betrayal, without becoming bitter, is its own kind of victory. That evening, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in a while. I wrote that strength doesn't always roar, sometimes it simply endures. I wrote that love, no matter how tested, should never be replaced by hatred, because hatred chains you to the very thing that tried to break you. When I finished, I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and let the house fall into its familiar stillness. I lay in bed thinking about how quiet justice can be, how it doesn't need applause, only truth. And as I drifted to sleep, I realized that the story was no longer about what I had lost, but about what I had found: peace, dignity, and the strength to choose silence over vengeance. A few days later, I woke up to the sound of gentle rain tapping against the window, the kind that makes everything outside look softer and cleaner. I brewed my morning coffee and sat by the window watching the drops slide down the glass, each one catching a glimmer of light before disappearing. It reminded me that even the heaviest storms eventually fade, leaving behind air that feels easier to breathe. Life had settled again, quietly and beautifully, in the way it always does after chaos has burned itself out. My son visited that weekend. He didn't bring gifts or apologies, just himself, standing in the doorway with tired eyes and a fragile smile. We sat for hours without talking much, just letting time mend what words couldn't. When he left, I hugged him tightly and whispered that some lessons cost more than they should, but they're never wasted if they teach us how to see people clearly. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the boy I once knew hiding behind the man who had lost his way. That night, I walked outside for a while, letting the cool air wrap around me. The moon was bright, the garden glistening with leftover rain, and in that quiet moment, I realized that everything I had fought for wasn't just about money or property. It was about keeping the parts of myself that life tried to take away. Dignity, peace, and self-respect are things no one can steal if you guard them with wisdom. I smiled to myself, thinking how proud Robert would be to see that I had carried his lessons to the very end. When I went back inside, I looked around my home. Every photo, every piece of furniture, every quiet memory, and felt whole again. I had survived the storm, not by shouting or fighting, but by standing still and letting truth do its work. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. It means more than you know. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and stay with me for the next one, because life has many lessons, and sometimes the quiet ones teach us the most.